Hello and welcome to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast, the show where we tackle tough questions about Scripture and explore the profound lessons hidden in its stories. I'm your host, Lance Smith, and today we're diving into one of the most surprisingly controversial topics. Was Beersheba named by Abraham or later by Isaac? Let's kick things off with Genesis 26:33 from the New Living Translation. So Isaac named the well Sheba, which means oath. And to this day, the town that grew up there is called Beersheba, which means well of the oath. This verse has sparked debate for centuries. Why does Genesis 21 say Abraham named Beersheba, but here Isaac names it again? Could it really be that two different people gave the same name to the same place? Or is there something deeper going on? Let's unpack the problem. Here's the problem as defined by the Big Book of Bible Difficulties. In Genesis 21:31, Abraham named the city Beersheba, well of the oath. But later, in Genesis 26:33, Isaac gave it the same name. But it is highly unlikely that two different people at two different times would call the same place by the same name. Okay, but here's my question. Why not? Could this duplication actually reflect a meaningful connection between Abraham and Isaac's experiences? Or is this story pointing us to something more symbolic about the legacy of the patriarchs? Now, here's a solution from the Big Book of Bible Difficulties, where they write this. This is not unlikely at all for two reasons. First, the second person was the son of the first person and may not have been familiar with the father's experience there. Second, Isaac's similar experience may have occasioned the memory of the name his father gave to this same place. So it is not at all uncommon that Isaac would have later renewed the name his father had earlier given this important place in their lives. Personally, I think this explanation leaves a bit more to be desired. There had to be a specific reason why Isaac named this place Beersheba again. What have caused him to do this? And is this an issue for atheists and skeptics to cast doubt upon the Bible? Surprisingly, yes. And I will cover that along with its myriad of problems in one of my possible explanations for the dual naming of Beersheba. We need to begin by looking at some background to understand this issue. The naming of Beersheba is attributed to both Abraham and Isaac in different parts of the Bible, which has led to some debate about the origin of the name, hence the need for this podcast episode. First, Abraham named Beersheba. Abraham named the place Beersheba after making a treaty with Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. We covered Abimelech in an earlier podcast. Here is a summary from Genesis 21 of what happened here. Beersheba is where Abraham and Abimelech, the king of Gerar, forged an important treaty. Abraham had settled in the region of the Negev after an earlier encounter where Abimelech mistakenly took Sarah into his harem, unaware she was Abraham's wife. Following divine intervention, Abimelech returned Sarah and extended peace offerings. Recognizing Abraham's favor with God, Abimelech sought an alliance, asking for mutual kindness and honesty, which Abraham agreed to. Later, a dispute over a well arose when Abimelech's servants took control of it. The issue was resolved when Abraham gave 7 ewe lambs to affirm his claim, and the place was named Beersheba, meaning well of the 7 or well of the treaty. To mark this pivotal moment, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree and called on the eternal God, signifying peace and divine blessing. Please check out the link in the show notes to holylandsite.com for some really interesting information about Beersheba. So again, Abraham first named the place Beersheba after a treaty with Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Why was this well so important? Was it simply a matter of survival in the desert, or did it symbolize something greater like peace and God's providence? When Abraham planted a tamarisk tree there and called on the name of the eternal God, was he also marking a spiritual milestone in his journey? Second, Isaac renamed Beersheba. Later, Isaac also named the place Beersheba after a similar encounter with Abimelech. Isaac's servants dug a well and found water, and he called it Sheba, which led to the place being called Beersheba. For this, GotQuestions.org gives a really good summary. And I quote, Beersheba also figures into the story of Abraham's son Isaac. Following in his father's footsteps, Isaac moved into the land of the Philistines when there was a famine in Canaan. We see this in Genesis 26. When he began to settle there, he found that all the wells his father's servants had dug had been filled up with dirt by the Philistines. All right, quickly back to me. This is important, the filling of the wells with dirt, and we'll revisit that in a moment. Back to the summary from GotQuestions.org. He reopened those wells and dug some new ones, which we see in verses 18 through 22. After that, Isaac went to Beersheba. There, the Lord appeared to him as he had done to his father Abraham and made him the same promise of a multitude of descendants. This is verses 23 through 24. As Abraham had done, Isaac built an altar and called upon the name of the Lord. In a repeat performance, Abimelech arrived and asked for yet another treaty with Isaac, identical to the one he made with Abraham. Isaac agreed. He prepared a feast for the king, and the two swore an oath of peace to each other. That's verses 30 through 31. On the same day, Isaac's servants discovered water in a new well they were digging, verse 32, and Isaac called the place Sheba, which means oath or seven. That's verse 33. In this way, Isaac perpetuated the name his father had given the place, and Beersheba became the name of the town that would later be built near the wells that Abraham and Isaac had named. All right, back to me. Years later, Isaac found himself in a strikingly similar situation. Why did Isaac need to dig wells his father had already dug? What does it mean that the Philistines had filled them with dirt? Was this more than just an act of sabotage? Could it reflect ongoing spiritual and cultural tension between Isaac's family and their neighbors? And when Isaac discovered water and named the well Sheba, was he simply honoring his father's legacy, or was he making a statement about his own faith and relationship with God? With that background, here are some possible explanations for the dual naming. First, the renewal of the name. One explanation is that Isaac renewed the name given by Abraham. This aligns with the Big Book of Bible Difficulties, which suggests that Isaac, perhaps unaware of the full details of his father's experience, reaffirmed the name to honor his encounter with God and Abimelech. Second, and this one will be fun, separate traditions and editorial harmonization. Atheists and skeptics often argue that these two are conflicting traditions edited together by later scribes. But is that explanation too simplistic? Could these repeated events actually reflect real historical patterns, where treaties over wells and territorial disputes were common across generations? And is it fair to dismiss these stories as mere fabrications meant to justify Israel's later claims to the land? For more detail regarding this explanation, let's look at the Contradictions in the Bible website, where they write this, and I quote, "Thus, the origin of the naming of Beersheba was preserved in two, once separate, traditions. In all likelihood, they were probably told in two separate communities and time periods, and only came together during a later process of collecting such traditions. In fact, it is quite possible that both versions of the story were originally about Abraham, and that when these two accounts were collected together, the scribe changed the name of Abraham to Isaac in one account in order to preserve them both. Furthermore, this cannot be an event that happens twice, let alone an event that actually happens at all, but rather a tradition whose purpose was to give the origin of the name of the border city where a treaty was made between Israel and the Philistines, and to legitimate who politically possessed it. Digging wells in the ancient world was a claim to the land. Such ancestral stories, therefore, serve to legitimate the possession of a place to a later time period, when these stories were written down. In other words, these stories were used to legitimate Judahite control and possession of Beersheba during the early monarchical period when Judah and the Philistines were rivals." End quote. What we see here is the dangerous use of what's known as presentism. If you're not familiar with the term presentism, here's a quick explanation. It means the practice of interpreting or evaluating historical events, people, or cultures through the lens of contemporary values, beliefs, and standards. It involves applying modern perspectives to past context, often overlooking the differences in societal norms, knowledge, and circumstances that shape the actions and ideas of the time. To explain further, it means using our 21st century morals and practices to judge actions of people in history. It's a nasty practice, holding people accountable for actions taken while they were completely unaware of today's standards of judgment. Here's the challenge. Are skeptics guilty of presentism, judging ancient texts by modern standards? Are they so focused on political motives that they miss the deeper theological significance of the story? I believe there are 5 specific issues with these separate traditions and editorial harmonization explanations favored by atheists and skeptics. Specifically, it poses 5 challenges or potential issues from a theological and textual perspective. First, or number 1, late composition hypothesis. Some skeptics argue that the story of Abraham and Isaac were written or altered much later during the monarchic period, claiming they were designed to serve political purposes. But this view clashes with the traditional understanding that these accounts are genuine, historical records of the patriarchs, stories preserved as divine revelation, not retroactive inventions. 2. Textual variations in editorial theory. Another claim is that these 2 stories were originally separate traditions that were merged into one, with some deliberate changes, like swapping Abraham's name for Isaac's. But this idea assumes heavy editorial manipulation and undermines the belief that the Scripture was divinely inspired and carefully preserved. Instead of trusting the Bible's consistency, it promotes unnecessary skepticism about its authenticity. 3. Rejection of repeated historical events. Then there's the argument that these events couldn't have happened twice. But why not? In ancient times, conflicts over wells and border disputes were common and often repeated across generations. Dismissing this possibility ignores historical patterns and reveals a bias more than a careful reading of the text. 4. Minimization of theological depth. Some critics frame these stories as mere political propaganda, an attempt to justify Israel's claim to the land. But this interpretation strips the stories of their deeper meaning. For believers, these aren't just territorial tales. They're about God's faithfulness to His promises, the legacy of His covenant with Abraham and Isaac, and the profound spiritual significance of the land. And finally, 5. Modern bias and ancient context analysis. Finally, the skeptic's view often imposes a modern perspective on these ancient texts. By focusing on power dynamics and political motives, they overlook the cultural and theological realities of the ancient Near East, where oral traditions, covenant theology, and deep spiritual truths shaped every story. This is where presentism comes into play, applying today's standards to a world vastly different from our own. Now, to be very generous in our final response to atheists and skeptics here, in short, these skeptical arguments often miss the big picture. And when we take time to understand these stories within their proper context, their depth and significance become all the more powerful. Finally, our last explanation for the naming of Beersheba is reaffirmation. By renaming the place Beersheba, Isaac reclaimed his father's legacy and renewed the covenant tied to that site. This wasn't just about survival, it was a spiritual declaration. It showed that God's promises to Abraham were still valid, and Isaac was carrying forward the faith of his father. This is the solution given by the gotquestions.org website, and it is my favorite explanation, as it gives a specific reason that the Big Book of Bible Difficulties leaves out. Yes, Beersheba was rediscovered by Isaac, according to Genesis 26:23-33, after Isaac had been forced to move several times due to disputes over wells with the local Philistines. He went up to Beersheba. There his servants dug a well, and they found water, which led Isaac reaffirming the name Beersheba, meaning well of the oath or well of seven, highlighting the covenant made there by his father Abraham with Abimelech. This narrative suggests that Isaac rediscovered the wells his father had dug, which had been filled in by the Philistines, and thus reestablished the significance of the place, end quote. All right, that's key to me. The wells had been filled in by the Philistines. Isaac's servants dug a well and again found water. And because of this, Isaac named the area once again Beersheba. So where do we land? The dual naming of Beersheba isn't a contradiction. It's a testament to the enduring faithfulness of God's covenant and the connection between Abraham and Isaac. Abraham marked the site with a treaty and a tree, signifying peace and divine provision. Isaac rediscovered the wells and renewed the name, reclaiming both the land and the spiritual legacy. The story reminds us that God's promises transcend time. They are passed down through generations, enduring despite obstacles and challenges. Thanks for joining me on this exploration of Bible difficulties. Next week, we'll tackle another fun question as we explore Genesis 26:34. How many wives did Esau have? Was it 2, 3, or 4? Until then, remember, the Bible isn't just about finding answers. It's about uncovering deeper truths. As always, we love hearing from our listeners. Please join our Bible Difficulties and Answers Facebook page where you can interact with me and other followers of the show. You may also reach us at our website, BibleDifficultiesandAnswers.podbean.com, or you may reach out to me directly at our email address, BibleDifficultiesandAnswers@gmail.com, with any questions, comments, concerns, fits of righteous indignation, or just to say hi. I'm always glad to hear from our listeners. Also, please like and subscribe to this podcast, tell a friend or two as well, and also write a review and give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, or any of your venues of choice. It really does help get the word out about the most amazing book ever written. Again, I'm Lance Smith. Until next time, I wish you good luck, good health, and God bless. So long, everybody.